So let's try to understand what actually tries to bring in multi-tenancy into the picture, right? So let's first try to understand the pain points around a normal way of doing things, and then we'll try to understand how the multi-tenancy is providing a solution to that problem. So let's take that you have your own product, right? It could be any product, any application. So you are bound to get customers, but when you get customers, you are also going to get various requirements from them. So the requirements sometimes could vary, and this is what typically the implementation phase of a product or application is going to contain, right? Implementing the specific requirements of the end customers. So in this case, let's take the first customer is coming and asking that, fine, I like your product, but then I want this particular form or a set of forms to contain my own specific set of fields. So your product doesn't currently have those fields, so I want to have them. Or it could even be that he doesn't want to have some of the fields which your product is already having. So either way is possible, right? And then another customer comes in, and then he says that the workflow that you are following may not work for me because my company's workflow is totally different. We have a very unique workflow in place, so you'll have to modify it and give me the product. That could be another scenario. The third scenario could be another customer coming in and saying that the business logic that you are using, for example, to calculate a benefit eligibility, it could be anything, right? It could be number of leaves available for an employee. It could be a sales commission logic, right? It could be any logic in the product. But the customer comes and says that the way we do it is completely different. Now, this is not a simple scenario because what happens is you can try to write your code generic enough, but in some instances, the requirements of these customers can totally vary as well as contradict each other, right? For example, the way you calculate benefit eligibility for one customer could be totally different and contradiction to the way you do it for another customer. So in this case, even though you try to generalize the product, generalize the business logic, it's not going to be feasible. And then there's another case where the customer asks that I want to have a very granular level of security control on the product or application, which means I should be able to determine who does what action at a granular level, say for example at a action level. So I can determine for my company which role performs what kind of action, and then I can determine or configure the system accordingly, right? So you end up in a real-time scenario having all these customers who are willing to buy your product or application, but then they're asking for these changes. They're asking for the product to be customized according to their needs. And the key thing is, if you're not customizing it, the customer is not going to like it. So you don't have an option as well. And given that your product, your competitors are willing to do this, you're obviously going to lose business, and hence overall it's not going to be a good picture. So what do you end up doing? You try ending up with customized versions of the product. So you take the product, you try to understand that particular customer's need, take a copy of your product, implement it for that customer so that you specifically set the fields he is asking for, you specifically set the business logic that they are asking for, right? You define a workflow very unique to that customer, load it all in that particular instance or the source code, and then you maintain these customized versions. So each of the customers are now getting the solution they asked for, but then from a solution provider perspective, is this the best thing you can do, right? Because as you could imagine, with 4 customers, fine, you can manage 4 different versions, but assume that you're going to keep adding customers. It's not going to be an easy job to maintain all these customized versions as well as keep managing these different versions. So what are the pain points? What are the challenges involved? So one fundamental challenge is the long implementation cycles. Because usually we say that the software cost already costs you so much, but then the implementation of it is also going to be taking up so much of cost. So one, from a value add perspective, from a cost perspective, it's not that attractive. The customer, while they want all these customizations, they hardly want to pay for it, right? So you also end up in spending long times of implementation, Sometimes implementation takes like 6 months, 8 months, depending on the size of the project and the customer. So in net, that it's not that attractive an option for value add to the customer. Uncontrolled breeding of applications. As you could see, you start multiplying these applications, so you quickly end up with a bunch of different versions of your product, which is going to be extremely difficult, and cost-wise, it's going to be very, very high in managing all these multiple applications, right? So you can take a simple example of a small release to be done. So you have to do it in so many different places, and more importantly, when you go for enhancements is basically you're adding more functionality. Because of these unique changes you have done for the respective customers, it's not going to be easy for you to do enhancements on these versions, which means you're going to either leave out these customers, they are going to stay with your old system, which means they are not getting the benefit of your further enhanced product. At the same time, when you have to implement these enhancements, you will have to go through a rigorous impact analysis in each of these versions to identify how these new enhancements are going to impact this customer, and then repeat the same steps as many times depending on the number of versions you're going to have. So any patches you want to upgrade, it's not going to be easy, because you need to talk to each customer. Each customer may have their own priorities. They may sometimes would want to change it, sometimes they don't want to change it. So upgrading the product or releasing patches is going to be taking a whole lot of time, which means your overall operation cost is going to be extremely high, as well as the maintenance overhead involved in managing all these things. So you end up forming a larger support team managing this whole thing, instead of having your team focus on building more features. And overall, the implementation team is going to be heavily dependent, because they are the ones who have implemented it. They know the exact requirements and how it has been implemented. So your dependency on them is going to be extremely high. So this is a typical scenario we have when you have different customers asking for different customizations on a product. Now, is there a way to handle the scenario in a much more easier way, in a much more organized way, right? So that is where multi-tenancy comes into picture. So in terms of multi-tenancy solution, the fundamental difference lies in building your product, not just with the functionality, not just a product, but a product which is capable of multi-tenancy, right? So you build your product with a multi-tenant architecture in place, which means the product on the architecture is capable of identifying all these customers through a set of settings. And these settings can contain the specific data about what the customer is looking for. For example, let's take the first case. This customer is asking for an additional field in an employee ad screen. Let's take an example, a field called hobby. So this customer settings information is going to keep track of that information. It's going to maintain that this customer X has requested for an additional field called hobby, and it has to appear in the employee screen. So assume that something can remember this and inform your product, or at the runtime can make your product add this field and display it only to that particular customer X, then you are achieving the requirement of that particular customer. At the same time, you don't have to worry about implementing it or changing it by customer. So tomorrow a different customer comes and asks for a different field, the same settings is going to keep track of this information as well, and then render it only for that customer. So each customer is uniquely identified as a tenant in the product or application. So this is a capability, fundamental capability that a multi-tenant architecture provides you in the first place. Because the moment you are able to identify a tenant, then anything and everything related to that particular customer's settings are stored against that tenant's data. So this gives you a very flexible way of addressing these various customers' requirements in a generic way. At the same time, it's very specific and stored only to that particular tenant information. So that is where a multi-tenancy itself comes into picture, and multi-tenant product really helps in solving. So here, as you could see, it's no more multiple versions of your code. So all the challenges we saw earlier are going to be not existing right over here. However, building a multi-tenant product, of course, the architecture is going to be much more complex. You have to think through about a lot of things, how the multi-tenancy is going to be constructed, how do you visualize your business requirement and map it to a multi-tenant scenario. So all of that is additional work, but then building this multi-tenant product is going to be saving you a lot of time and money down the line over a period of time. So this is a typical approach between a single and multi-tenant scenarios, right?